Okay, so we're on our week 3. You'll see one of the things I passed out was an adjusted schedule. I said the very first week it's subject to change, and lo and behold, after the second week, I had to change things up because I needed to adjust the schedule for what we were doing. So this will be the last week of like introductory material before we actually get into the Old Testament. Like I said before, we wanted to kind of set the stage with literary context, and this week we'll be covering cultural context, doing our best to kind of get in the mindset of the Israelites, ancient Israelites, before we take the Old Testament properly. So, I think the first slide I have is a quote, if you want to go ahead and... Oh, and did we start recording? Awesome. Okay, so kind of the need for why we're doing this, quote from one of my old professors: "The Hebrew Bible is an ancient text that was written at a time and place very far away from where we sit today. It describes events from the Bronze and Iron Ages, which is the 2nd and 1st millennia BC, which are set in the ancient Near Eastern cultural context and are written in ancient Semitic languages. Therefore, it's essential that the reader closes the gap between him and herself and the ancient text by considering archaeological and ancient Near Eastern sources that demonstrate relevance to the biblical material." So that's Dr. Kenway. He was my Old Testament professor at Talbot. So that's what we're trying to do. At the bottom line is the Bible is an ancient Eastern text. We are modern Western thinkers and readers, and we need to recognize that gap and do our best to close it. So if you want to hit that next slide. To me, if you know me, I love Star Wars. It's a bit like this. It happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. This stuff happened thousands of years ago in a land totally different from ourselves, and I think sometimes we subconsciously put it in that same category of almost fiction, that it's just a fanciful story that happened a long time ago. But when we start to dig in, we realize this happened in history. This actually happened. And so, I'm going to do our best to take it out of that category and bring it to something more relatable. So I've picked out 4 major areas. Did everybody get a handout as they walked in? 4 major areas to highlight the difference in our thinking and the ancient Near Eastern thinking. And in each of those 4 areas, we're going to show how it differs from our thinking, and in that, how maybe Israel was distinct from her neighbors in the ancient Near Eastern culture. And in some sections, we'll have some good discussion questions. So we're going to dive in with the first topic right away. And everybody got a handout, yes? Okay. So the first one is the difference between group identity and individual identity. So you can go ahead and hit the next slide, Rick. Try to do some fancy transitions. Not sure it worked. But anyways, so group identity versus individual identity. You have your identity derived from the identity of the group as opposed to the individual. This is quite different from our modern way of thinking. Another aspect is your status in society is ascribed to you, not achieved. This is something that we think in our modern Western world is you can achieve your status. I mean, there's a lot of caveats to that with socioeconomic opportunities, but we won't get into that. But in the Western world, you can earn your way and achieve your way to a certain level of status. Back in that day, whatever status you were born into was the status you were in. There are still cultures like that today. But you couldn't really move up the ladder or anything like that. Another aspect of this category is hierarchy is a key value, not equality. Something very different from how we think nowadays. Structure is very, very important to them. And then the last one's also very important. Corporate solidarity, not private autonomy. That kind of goes along with our individualistic culture. We like to do things on our own, forge our own path, not be told what to do. You can see when you read Scripture, people introduce themselves as, I would say, I'm Zach, son of James, son of James, son of, you can trace your lineage and who you are, your identity is derived from your family lineage or your group or your tribe lineage. Today, that's not necessarily the case. The family's still very important, but people even legally change their names to whatever they want if they want to. So there's that. In this category, the way Israel is distinct from the rest of her ancient Near Eastern neighbors is that also something that's very, very important, probably above group identity, is obedience to Yahweh and his covenant was of the utmost importance in Israel. And so knowing all this, we're going to go ahead and dive right into our first discussion question for people. I know that was very quick, but we want to look at a few characters in the Old Testament based on these differences between our thinking and an ancient Near Eastern way of thinking and see, are these people good examples that we want to emulate or bad examples based on the group identity versus individual identity principle. So I'll give you the first one, and then I'll break you guys into 4 groups and give you each a person, and then you can decide based on the passage if they were a good example or a bad example. So Achan was somebody in Israel when they were conquering the land in Joshua. After Jericho fell, the Lord had given a command to not take any of the plunder, but Achan did, and this was sinful for him. But we see in the group identity world, the consequences of Achan's sin didn't just extend to him, it extended to his family and even all of Israel. They failed to take the city of, I call it Ai, it's just 2 letters, but it's hard to pronounce. So they failed to take that city because of this one man's sin. It affected the whole group. So he would be what would be a bad example. Okay, we're going to go on to the next major area in how we think differently from ancient Near Easterners. I heard Luke ask, what is ANE, Ancient Near East? Sorry, I think I took that for granted that that's a common acronym for, nerds like me, but not for the general population. So the next fill in the blanks for the major category of how we think differently than the ancient Near Easterns is polytheism versus scientific naturalism. That's kind of the broad worldview in today's age, that all we can see or measure is all that there is. We as Christians, a lot of religions do ascribe to there being a spiritual realm, but I think we would all admit that this scientific naturalism has affected our thinking to a large degree. We keep them in distinct, neat categories. We have our 3 physical dimensions, and when we think of the spiritual world, we tend to think, or at least I do, tend to think of it as something other than what exists in these 3 dimensions. That was not the case back in the ancient times. You can go ahead and hit that first point there, Rick. Everything back in that day was spiritual, versus here everything is natural. And so what I mean by that is that there was no separation between the physical world and the spiritual world in ancient times. They were intricately intertwined, and you could not separate them. And we'll get into that a little more later. But that's a very important distinction between how we think and how they did. The next point, things happen because of this way of thinking. When things happened because the gods were acting, versus nowadays we think that things happen because of the laws of nature. We see the sun rise, we know that happens because the earth rotates once every 24 hours, and so then we see the sun once every 24 hours. When they saw the sun rise, they thought the sun god was making his circuit across the sky. The sun was not just an object, it was a god also. And so this next point about how Israel was distinct from her ancient Near Eastern neighbors. So here's your word of the day. And this I had to pull out of a book because there's some nuance to to this. So henotheism, not necessarily that only one God exists, which is monotheism, but that only one God is truly worthy of worship. And so remember, back in the ancient Near Eastern, the prevalent idea was that there are gods everywhere, and that each of these gods had their own sphere of jurisdiction and authority, like the wind god or the sun god or crops, all that stuff. So to nuance the terms, heno, the prefix there, means one. It means one in Greek. Monos means alone. So it's not like an ancient Israelite thought that only one God existed, rather that only one God was truly worthy of that title and of that category. Here's a quote from John Walton to help nuance this meaning. Throughout the Old Testament, Yahweh consistently reveals that he's in a class by himself and brooks no competition. No other being is worthy of the designation God and has the authority associated with the category or is deserving of the worship that is the natural response to such a being. And so what we see then in Israel and in the Bible is the difference between Israel and her neighbors is her neighbors had a pantheon of gods, whereas you see a concept called the divine council in Israel. And so this is a pretty, I would say, radical idea. I don't think I was ever taught this growing up, but when you study the Old Testament, you can see this idea in the Old Testament. We just talked about group identity. In the ancient Near East, the pagan cultures, when they would try and create the gods in their image, being group-oriented cultures, there were a group of gods. And the pantheon was the community of the gods. There was many of them, and if you read that literature, those gods struggle with one another. They're very much like humans. They're very much flawed, and they struggle, and there's intrigue and all that stuff in the pantheon. But it was a similar idea existed in ancient Israel, but it was very different in that we have something called the divine council, where only Yahweh had ultimate authority and jurisdiction over everything. But the Old Testament describes God as a God who rules and makes judgment in a divine council. So there's passages like Job 1 where he gathers the sons of God and talks about Job, and it says Satan approaches God. That's the Hebrew word for the adversary, and there's this council idea going on. There's an odd passage in 1 Kings, I say odd because it seems odd to us, in 1 Kings 22, when a lot of the drama with Israel is going on, where God has a council before him of seemingly spiritual beings and is deliberating with them, things like that. So similar idea, but major difference in Israel, where that Yahweh is the sole authoritative power. And so I think I put up a next slide. Yeah, what does the divine council teach us about God? So I got this out of John Walton's Old Testament Theology for Christians. What this reveals to us, which rings true to us, I believe, is that Yahweh uses servants to carry out his will, even though theoretically he doesn't need to do so. Yahweh holds his servants accountable and will even judge them for their failings, is the second point. Yeah. Third point, that Yahweh values community and consultation even for himself. And that, number 4, even though he surrounds himself with servants to whom he delegates tasks, Yahweh retains his status as the sole being in his class. He is not simply a high God among others. And then the last one, political wrangling, which you see in ancient Near Eastern pantheons, does not take place in Yahweh's council. His rule is supreme. And so I feel like this rings true for us even today as New Testament, New Covenant believers. God uses us as the church and delegates tasks to us to carry out his will. We know God is all powerful, and he could do whatever he wants to do. He doesn't need to employ us to achieve his purposes, but he does. And we see this idea even in the Old Testament. So that's kind of why I brought this up. Yeah. So I don't have a discussion question on that because that can go down a lot of rabbit holes. But yeah, go ahead. No, I'm going to send this out. Yeah, sorry if I didn't say it. I'm going to send these bullet points out. So yes. Okay. Next major category of thinking is ancient cosmology versus modern cosmology. So I'll let you fill in the blanks there for a second. So I want to hit on why this is important real quick. So a definition of... Oh, sorry. So you're going to go back just for a second, Rick? Ancient cosmology. Oh, by the way, this is a building list, so those are the first two main points you've already done. That third point is the third one we're on. So ancient cosmology versus modern cosmology. So why this is important, if you think about it, the way that you think of how the universe is structured actually informs a lot of the way you think. And so go ahead and go through this slide. Things that were different for them that they thought so differently from us. They thought the earth was a flat disk, not a sphere. You think of that one fact alone. I already mentioned, we believe the sun rises because the earth rotates once every 24 hours. We get seasons because the earth goes around the sun. They did not think that. They thought that they were stationary, that the earth was a flat disk, and that the sun went around them. So consequently, the next point, earth and mankind are at the center of the universe. Versus nowadays in our modern thinking, the center of the universe is some center of the universe that means nothing to us. We're a tiny insignificant speck on a piece of dust. So I'm not advocating that the earth is flat, by the way. I'm just trying to illustrate how they thought and how this informs the way that they think. Okay, the next point is quite interesting, and this illustrates how differently they thought than how we thought. So this is more ancient Near Easterns in general, not Israelites, but they believe that nature was made up of the gods, not matter. In our modern scientific world, we look at things by their elements. They believe nature was actually made up of the gods. So Israel's distinctive from how they thought between the ancient Near Eastern cultures was that was this point. They didn't quite adhere to this. So go ahead and get to the next point there. So nature was emptied of deity in the Israelite view. So I have a couple slides to illustrate this point, some pictures, because this is so different from us. So this is a comparative worldview between the ancient Near Eastern culture and Israel. So in creation, you have the realm of nature and deity all as one thing for ancient Near Easterns. People occupy a distinct place in nature or in the universe. And then outside of that, there's just this impersonal, primordial realm. That sphere of nature and deity is where the pantheon would have existed and lived and struggled. But in Israel, it was similar view, but all of nature was emptied of that deity, and God existed outside of that, governing, ruling, all that. Next slide. This is an ancient Egyptian picture actually depicting the universe. So, knowing that, what do you notice about this picture? Yep, there's a man in the middle. Yep. Yeah. Yep. So I think you both are talking about the same one. So there's a being covering the whole thing. So they believed that there was a dome over the whole world. That's called the firmament. So in ancient Near Eastern cultures, that was a god. You can see there's stars all over the body. So the stars were actually in the firmament. On top of that being, you can see in a boat on the left of it is the sun god making his circuit over the firmament. The being in the middle would be the sky or the wind god, holding that expanse that was created between the firmament, the ground deity. So these were all actual deities in their mind. The ground was actually the earth god. The sun was actually the sun god. The sky, or what we call the sky, the firmament, was a god to them. So next picture is a modern interpretation of Israel's view of how the universe was. So similar structure, but there's no deity in it other than God and his throne on the very top. So you could see the dome, the flat disk, mountains around that. They believe the mountains were holding up the firmament. The sun is inside. There's the waters above, waters below. Very different from how we see the world. And you can imagine if this is what you truly believe the world to be, how different you would read certain passages, like Psalm 103:19. The Lord has established his throne in the heavens. Isaiah 66:1 says, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. I mean, that makes sense based off of how they believe the world was laid out. And it's very interesting to keep this in mind also as you read through like the creation count and all that. So my next discussion question for you guys, you can take 5 minutes on this, and you can group up however you want in this one. But why did God not reveal the way he really made the world as he revealed himself in the Old Testament? So one of the interesting things I like to point out is in Genesis 1, it says that like God made the firmament. In our modern view of the world, that doesn't actually exist. So that right there is a point to show that God communicated in the language that they did. So why did God communicate and reveal himself like that and not say, reveal more true things about nature? Yeah, absolutely. How cumbersome would it have been for God to say, I made the world. It's not the world you think. You're not on a flat disk. You're actually on a spinning sphere, and that spinning sphere is going around. So when I say I made the sun and the moon, this is what I actually mean that I made. To your point, what he does to us is he says, this world that I made this world. And he comes to us, which is we see all throughout Scripture, is that he meets us where we're at. And I would just say the words divine accommodation. God accommodates where we're at to reveal himself, and he comes to us. So yeah, absolutely. And I like how you added in there the difference between other cultures where they had to continually go to these gods that never communicated with them to try and figure out who they were, what they were like, what they wanted. And God throughout Scripture is so different. And how he comes to us, tells us who he is like and what exactly he's looking for out of us. So, yeah. Okay, we got one more main difference we want to cover, and then we'll be done in about 10 minutes. And by all means, if we're hitting the time and you have children you need to go get, feel free to go get them. We have about 10 minutes left. So the last one is another area that is hard to wrap our minds around, but I think important to point out just to illustrate how differently we think now than ancient Near Easterners, is functional ontology versus spatial ontology. So ontology is just the fancy word for what it means to actually exist. And for us, spatial ontology is just means like something exists because it occupies space. It's there. I know this cup of coffee exists because you can see it, you can measure it. Kind of goes along with our scientific naturalism point of view. And there's more nuance to the way ancient Near Easterners believed something existed. So if you hit the next slide, ancient Near Easterners believed something existed if it met 3 criteria. One, if it was a distinct entity, so that makes sense to us, kind of this coffee cup is different from this computer, so those are different things. It had to have a name, and then it also had to have a function. So I'll give you a second to write those three things down. When you think about it and have these criteria in your head as you read the Old Testament, you see a lot of themes of names. There's a big theme of, how God describes himself, the names he gives himself. And a lot of those names describe things that he does. Even a lot of the Hebrew names, if you dig into them, Hebrew names of people in the Old Testament are describing the way God acts. An example I put in my notes was Joshua means Yahweh saves. And most names in the Old Testament have significance for things that Yahweh is doing. And so I know we didn't do a deep dive on this, but another discussion question to wrap up is, you read Psalm 14:1. If you want to go to the next slide, just the first verse of Psalm 14:1 says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." And so thinking that the nuance of how ancient Near Easterners thought of existing being tied also in with function and acting and name, what might the psalmist be communicating in Psalm 14:1 when he says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God"? So just a quick reminder that back in that day, being an atheist wasn't really a category. They believed gods were everywhere. So go ahead and group back up for maybe 2 or 3 minutes and discuss what the psalmist might be communicating with this statement.